Today we're going to be reading chapter 10, which starts on page 194. Richard is now between the ages of 17 and 19. He's finished high school, and he's been traveling around Jackson doing various jobs, having difficulty maintaining these jobs because he doesn't respect his white bosses the way most of the time they feel like he should. He forgets to say sir, or he'll answer very curtly, or he'll look at them in an inappropriate manner, and ultimately he ends up getting fired. Richard is still struggling with that because he didn't grow up around a lot of white people. He was very sheltered because of his grandma's religion. She didn't allow him to work like most of the boys his age, so he hadn't grown accustomed to kind of being the way that they wanted him to. So as we begin chapter 10, leaving from chapter 9, in the previous chapter, Richard had held a job at a local clothing store, but he got fired from that. While he was there, there were several things that disturbed him, including witnessing a black female being escorted into the store and ultimately raped in the back room. He didn't actually see that happen, but he heard it happen. The white owner and his son raped her because she failed to pay her bill. In addition to that, while he was working at the store, he was on the way to the store one day riding a bicycle. A group of white young men stopped, asked him if he wanted to hitch a ride, I guess on the back of a truck, and he's kind of holding on to his bike as they're moving. They ask him if he wants some alcohol, and he says, "Oh no," and he failed to say sir, and so ultimately the boys throw an alcohol bottle at his head, knocking him off the truck, and then they stop. And they threatened to beat him at this time, but one of the boys suggests that they move on because he'd already been hurt enough after falling off the truck. And then the third incident is he was delivering some clothes on that bicycle in one of the white neighborhoods in the evening and was stopped by a police officer who told him to make sure that his bosses never sent him into a white neighborhood again in the dark. Again, Richard put up with all this while he was working at the store and ultimately was fired from there because the owner or the owner's son didn't care for the way that he responded to them. So then he got a pretty good job with the assistance of one of his friends, Griggs, from school, working in an optical store for a man from up north, and that proved to be very promising. The man from up north was very complimentary to Richard, treated him very well, but the two other southern white men that worked at the optical store did not share the same mentality toward Richard, and when the boss is gone, they actually corner him, threaten him, and ultimately Richard ends up leaving, and this is where we pick up at the beginning of chapter 10. So, page 194. For weeks after that, I could not believe in my feelings, and by after that he means after leaving the optical store. My personality was numb, reduced to a lumpish, loose, dissolved state. I was a non-man, something that knew vaguely what it was, that it was human, but felt that it was not. As time separated me from the experience, I could feel no hate for the men who had driven me from the job. They did not seem to be individual men, but part of a huge, implacable elemental design toward which hate was futile. What I did feel was a longing to attack, but how? And because I knew of no way to grapple with this thing, I felt doubly cast out. I went to bed tired and got up tired, and though I was having no physical exercise. During the day I overreacted to each event, my banked emotions spilling around it. I refused to talk to anyone about my affairs because I knew that I would only hear justification of the ways of the white folks, and I did not want to hear it. I lived carrying a huge wound, tender, festering, and I shrank when I came near anything that I thought would touch it. But I had to work because I had to eat, and my next job was that of a helper in a drugstore, and the night before I reported for work, I fought with myself, telling myself that I had to master this thing, that my life depended on it. And by this thing he means acting appropriately in front of white people. Other black people worked, got along somehow, then I must get along until I could get my hands on enough money to leave. I would make myself fit in. Others had done it. I would do it. I had to do it. I went to the job, apprehensive, resolving to watch my every move. I swept the sidewalk, pausing when a white person was 20 feet away. I mopped the store, cautiously waiting for the white people to move out of my way in their own good time. I cleaned acres of glass shelving, changed my tempo now to work faster, holding every nuance of reality within the focus of my consciousness. Noon came and the store was crowded, and people jammed into the counters for food. A white man behind the counter ran up to me and shouted, "A jug of Coca-Cola, quick, boy!" My body jerked taut, and I stared at him, and he stared at me. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," I said. "Well, move! Don't stand there gaping." Even if I had tried, I could not have told him what was wrong. My sustained expectation of violence had exhausted me. My preoccupation with curbing my impulses, my speech, my movements, my manners, my expressions had increased my anxiety. I became forgetful, concentrating too much upon trivial tasks. The men began to yell at me, and that made it worse. One day I dropped a jug of orange syrup in the middle of the floor. The boss was furious. He caught my arm and jerked me into the back of the drugstore. His face was livid. I expected him to hit me, and I was braced to defend myself. "I'm going to deduct that from your pay, you black bastard," he yelled. Words had come instead of blows, and I relaxed. "Yes, sir," I said placatingly. It was my fault. My tone whipped him to a frenzy. "You goddamn right it was," he yelled louder. "I'm new at this," I mumbled, realizing that I had said the wrong thing, though I had been striving to say the right. "We're only trying you out," he warned me. "Yes, sir, I understand," I said. He stared at me, speechless with rage. Why could I not learn to keep my mouth shut at the right time? I had just said one short sentence too many. My words were innocent enough, but they indicated, it seemed, a consciousness on my part that infuriated white people. Saturday night came and the boss gave me my money and snapped, "Don't come back. You won't do." I knew what was wrong with me, but I could not correct it. The words and actions of white people were baffling signs to me. I was living in a culture and not a civilization, and I could learn how that culture worked only by living with it. Misreading the reactions of whites around me made me say and do the wrong things. In my dealing with whites, I was conscious of the entirety of my relations with them, and they were conscious only of what was happening at a given moment. I had to keep remembering what others took for granted. I had to think out what others felt. I had begun coping with the white world too late. I could not make subservience an automatic part of my behavior. I had to feel and think out each tiny item of racial experience in the light of the whole race problem, and to each item I brought the whole of my life. While standing before a white man, I had to figure out how to perform each act and how to say each word. I could not help it. I could not grin. In the past I had always said too much. Now I found that it was difficult to say anything at all. I could not react as the world in which I live expected me to. That world was too baffling and too uncertain. I was idle for weeks, and the summer waned. Hope for school was now definitely gone. Autumn came, and many of the boys who held jobs returned to school. Jobs were now numerous. I heard that hall boys were needed at one of the hotels, the hotel in which Ned's brother had lost his life. Should I go there? Would I, too, make a fatal slip? But I had to earn money. I applied and was accepted to mop long white-tiled hallways that stretched around the entire perimeter of the office floors of the building. I reported each night at 10, got a full pail of water, a bushel of soap flakes, and with a gang of moppers I worked. All the boys were Negroes, and I was happy. At least I could talk, joke, laugh, sing, and say what I pleased. I began to marvel at how smoothly the black boys acted out the roles that the white race had mapped out for them. Most of them were not conscious of living a special, separate, stunted way of life. Yet I knew that in some period of their growing up, a period that they had no doubt forgotten, there had been developed in them a delicate, sensitive, controlling mechanism that shut off their minds and emotions from all that the white race had said was taboo. Although they lived in an America where in theory there existed equality of opportunity, they knew unerringly what to aspire to and what not to aspire to. Had a black boy announced that he would aspire to be a writer, he would have been unhesitatingly called crazy by his pals. Or had a black boy spoken of yearning to get a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, his friends, in the boy's own interest, would have reported his odd ambition to the white boss. There was a pale yellow boy who had gonorrhea and was proud of it. "Say," he asked me one night, "you ever have the clap?" "God, no," I said. "Why do you ask?" "I got it," he said matter-of-factly. "I thought you could tell me something to use." "Haven't you been to a doctor?" I asked. "Aw, hell, them doctors ain't no good." "Don't be foolish," I said. "What's the matter with you?" he demanded of me. "You talk like you'd be ashamed of the clap." "I would," I said. "Hell, you ain't a man unless you done had it 3 times," he said. "Don't brag about it," I said. "'Tain't nothing worse than a bad cold," he said. But I noticed that when he urinated he would grab hold of the steam pipe, a door jamb, or a window sill and strain with tear-filled eyes and a tortured face as though he were attempting to lift the hotel from its foundations. I laughed to cover my disgust. When I was through mopping I would watch the never-ending crap games that went on in the lockers, but I could never become interested enough to participate. Gambling had never appealed to me, and I could not conceive of any game holding more risk than the life I was living. Curses and sex stories sounded round the clock, and the blue smoke choked the air. I would sit listening for hours, wondering how on earth they could laugh so freely, trying to grasp the miracle that gave their debased lives the semblance of human existence. Several Negro girls were employed as maids in the hotel, some of whom I knew, and one night I was about to go home I saw a girl who lived in my direction, and I fell in beside her to walk part of the distance together. As we passed the white night watchman, he slapped her playfully on her buttocks. I turned around amazed. The girl twisted out of his reach, tossed her head saucily, and went down the hallway. I had not moved from my tracks. "Nigger, you look like you don't like what I did," he said. I could not move or speak. My immobility must have seemed a challenge to him, for he pulled his gun. "Don't you like it, nigger?" "Yes, sir," I whispered with a dry throat. "Well, talk like it then, goddammit." "Oh, yes, sir," I said with as much heartiness as I could muster. I walked down the hall, knowing that the gun was pointed at me, but afraid to look back. When I was out the door my throat felt as though it were swelling and bursting with fire, and the girl was waiting for me. I walked past her, and she caught up with me. "God, how could you let him do that?" I exploded. "It don't matter. They do it all the time," she said. "I wanted to do something," I said. You would have been a fool if you had," she said. "But how must you feel?" They never get any further with us than that, if we don't want them to," she said dryly. "Yes, I would have been a fool," I said, but she did not catch the point. I was afraid to go to work the following night. What would the watchman think? Would he decide to teach me a lesson? I walked slowly through the door, wondering if he would continue his threat. His eyes looked at and through me, and evidently he considered the matter closed, or else he had so many experiences of that kind that he had already forgotten it. Out of my salary I had begun to save a few dollars, for my determination to leave had not lessened, but I found the saving exasperatingly slow. I pondered continuously ways of making money, and the only ways that I could think of involved transgressions of the law. No, I must not do that, I told myself. To go to jail in the South would mean the end, and there was the possibility that if I was ever caught I would never reach jail. This was the first time in my life that I had ever consciously entertained the idea of violating the law of the land. I had felt that my intelligence and industry could cope with all situations, and, until that time, I had never stolen a penny from anyone. Even hunger had never driven me to appropriate what was not my own. The mere idea of stealing had been repugnant. I had not been honest from deliberate motives, but being dishonest had simply never occurred to me. Yet all about me Negroes were stealing. More than once I had been called a dumb nigger by black boys who discovered that I had not availed myself of a chance to snatch some petty piece of white property that had been carelessly left within my reach. "How in the hell are you going to get ahead?" I had been asked when I had said that I ought not to steal. I knew that the boys in the hotel filched whatever they could, and I knew that Griggs, my friend, who worked in the Capitol Street jewelry store, was stealing regularly and successfully. I knew that a black neighbor of mine was stealing bags of grain from a wholesale house where he worked, though he was a staunch deacon in his church and prayed and sang on Sundays. I knew that the black girls who worked in white homes stole food daily to supplement their scanty wages, and I knew that the very nature of black and white relations bred this constant thievery. I'm going to stop now, and you can start the next video to finish out Chapter 10.